Okay, ready to dive into something pretty disturbing.
I'm ready.
All right, we're tackling the Slenderman stabbing from back in 2014.
Oh, yeah.
Those two 12-year-old girls, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weir,
Right.
who convinced their friend to go into the woods
Uh-huh.
and stabbed her like 19 times
Yeah.
because they thought it would please this fictional internet creature, Slenderman.
Yeah, I think a lot of people remember that case pretty
It
vividly.
was huge, right?
Yeah.
And just so disturbing on so many levels.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really captured that clash between, you know, internet culture and this kind of like primal fear and violence.
Totally. And now, over a decade later,
Wow.
Morgan Geyser has actually been released,
Oh, wow.
which brings up so many questions about how we view justice and mental health, rehabilitation.
It makes you wonder if things would be different if it happened today, with all the changes in how we view things.
Right. Like, would she even be in prison at all?
Yeah, exactly. It's a huge question.
For sure. And what's really cool about this deep dive is that our source material
Yeah.
comes from someone who actually spent time with Morgan Geyser
Wow.
at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. So we're getting a really personal perspective here
That's incredible.
on her life and her struggles.
That's so valuable, getting beyond just the headlines,
Exactly. Going way deeper than just the simplified narrative that you usually get with these kinds of cases.
For sure.
So before we get into all of that, can you just remind us of what happened, like the basic facts of the case?
Sure. So it was Morgan's 12th birthday, and she and Anissa invited their friend Peyton Leutner
Right.
to play hide and seek in the woods.
Hide and seek?
But what Peyton didn't know was that Morgan and Anissa were, like, totally convinced
Oh, wow.
that Slenderman was real
Mm.
and that they had to, like, kill someone to become his proxies
Yeah.
and, like, avoid being killed themselves.
They thought they had to kill someone.
They really did.
What?
It's just a chilling example of how deeply they had bought into this delusional world.
Yeah, 19 stab wounds.
It's hard to even fathom.
It's hard to fathom, right? Like, how can these young girls do something like that?
Right, and that's exactly why it's so important to, look beyond just the sensationalism and consider the full context.
I agree.
Like, we know that both girls were struggling. Morgan, for example, was dealing with abuse at home from her father.
Right, and our source actually reveals that this abuse had been going on for years.
Years.
Years. So how do you think that kind of, like, prolonged trauma might have
Yeah.
impacted Morgan, especially at such a young age?
Well, childhood trauma can have a really devastating impact on a developing mind. Like, it can, distort their perceptions of reality, impair their decision-making, and, like, make them more susceptible to, manipulation or these, like, extreme beliefs.
Yeah, yeah.
So in Morgan's case, it's very possible that the abuse she endured contributed to her vulnerability to this Slenderman delusion. Like, it's almost like she was searching for an escape from a reality that was already terrifying.
That makes sense. So we're not
Yeah.
just talking about a random act of violence here, right? There's this complex interplay of factors,
Right.
mental health, trauma, and then this disturbing internet mythology all mixed up together.
Exactly. And what's even more tragic is that those critical details were often, like, totally overshadowed
Oh, yeah.
by the sensationalized focus on Slenderman.
Like, it was just easier to focus on the Slenderman angle
Yeah.
than to deal with these complex
Right.
issues of
Right.
mental health and trauma.
Absolutely.
It seems like everyone, the justice system, the media, everyone was so fixated on Slenderman that they
Yeah.
missed the bigger picture.
They did.
That these were two deeply troubled girls acting out in this tragically misguided way.
Yeah.
But before we get into the legal aspects of the case, I want to understand more about Morgan's, mental state.
Okay.
Can you tell us more about her psychological profile?
Yeah, sure.
Especially in relation to this belief in Slenderman.
So, according to our source, Morgan was diagnosed with schizophrenia at a very young age.
Oh, wow.
And, schizophrenia can manifest in many different ways.
Right.
But in Morgan's case, it involved, like, vivid hallucinations, delusions of grandeur, and a really distorted sense of reality.
So Slenderman, for her, wasn't just a scary story.
No.
It was real.
He was a real presence for her.
Wow.
This powerful entity who, like, held her life in his hands.
It's almost like Slenderman became a coping mechanism.
Yeah,
A way for her to explain the chaos and fear she was experiencing in her own life.
absolutely.
But Anissa also believed in Slenderman, right?
Right, she did.
What was her background like?
Well, Anissa's story is also really heartbreaking. She was dealing with neglect at home and possibly even incest, although those details are still somewhat unclear. She also had an undiagnosed learning disability, which contributed to social isolation and low self-esteem.
So both of these girls were carrying this like huge weight of trauma and unaddressed mental health issues.
Right.
And then you add in the influence of Slenderman, and it's a recipe for disaster.
It really is.
And to make matters worse, they were so young.
Yeah.
Like, how did the justice system handle their cases?
Well, that's where things get really, really complicated. At the time, Wisconsin had some of the harshest laws in the country for prosecuting juveniles as adults.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It was the era of the super predator theory,
Oh, right.
which led to a wave of policies that emphasized punishment over rehabilitation,
Oh, wow.
even for very young offenders.
Even for kids this young?
Yeah, even for kids that young.
Wow. So the prosecution's approach seems so harsh, especially knowing what we do about their background.
Oh, yeah.
What was their reasoning for pushing to try them as adults?
Well, the prosecution argued that the crime was premeditated
Okay.
and that the girls understood the gravity of their actions. They focused on, like, the meticulous planning involved, the fact that they brought a weapon to the scene,
Right.
and the brutality of the attack.
But how can you really grasp the concept of, like, premeditation
Yeah.
when you're dealing with 12-year-olds
Right.
who are clearly struggling with severe mental health issues?
That was precisely the defense's argument. They argued that the girls' delusions
Yeah.
were so powerful that they couldn't distinguish between, fantasy and reality,
Yeah.
making it impossible for them to fully comprehend the consequences of their actions.
Right. It seems like there's this huge disconnect here between the legal definition of premeditation
Yeah.
and the reality of these girls' mental states. This case really forces us to think about the limits of our justice system,
It does.
especially when it comes to dealing with young offenders and mental illness.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll explore in a lot more detail as we, delve into the legal proceedings, the girls' time at Winnebago,
Okay.
and the events that ultimately led to Morgan's release.
Stay tuned because it gets even more complex from here.
So we've talked about how Morgan and Anissa were, facing some really serious challenges.
Yeah.
And how the justice system at the time wasn't exactly set up to handle all those nuances.
Right.
So let's talk about what happened next.
Okay, yeah. I'm really curious about the judge in this case, Judge Boren.
Yeah.
He was pretty controversial, right?
He definitely became like a lightning rod in this whole case.
I remember reading something about him comparing mental illness to believing in Santa Claus.
Oh, yeah, he did. He made a comment about that, and it drew a lot of criticism.
Wow.
It seemed to, trivialize the seriousness of Morgan and Anissa's conditions.
Right.
And it really raised questions about his ability to, fairly assess their mental competency.
It's hard to imagine a judge saying something like that today
Right.
with all the awareness around mental health now.
Yeah, the landscape has definitely shifted since 2014.
For sure.
But back then, there was still a lot of stigma surrounding mental illness.
Right.
And it wasn't uncommon for it to be, dismissed or downplayed,
Yeah.
even in legal settings.
So both girls ended up being tried as adults.
They did.
What were the outcomes of their trials?
Well, they both entered pleas of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, or what we call NGRI.
NGRI.
Anissa's trial went first,
Okay.
and the jury found her NGRI. She was sentenced to 25 years in a mental health facility.
Okay.
But that verdict sparked, a ton of public outrage. A lot of people felt like she was getting away with, attempted murder.
Yeah, I get that. It's hard to wrap your head around,
It is.
like the severity of the crime versus the idea that someone could be, not responsible because of mental illness.
Right.
It's tough. How did the NGRI defense play out in Morgan's case?
Well, Morgan's case was a little more complicated.
Okay.
While she was also found NGRI,
Mm-hmm.
Judge Boren, the same judge who had made those, controversial comments about mental illness,
Right.
sentenced her to 40 years in a mental health facility.
40 years. That seems so harsh.
It was a very lengthy sentence.
It feels like Judge Boren's biases really played a role there.
It's hard to say for sure, but his conduct throughout both trials definitely raised concerns about his impartiality.
Yeah.
Some people even suggested that his tough stance was politically motivated, because he was up for re-election at the time
Oh, right.
in a pretty conservative district.
That makes sense. So they both ended up at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute.
They did.
What can you tell us about the conditions there?
So Winnebago has a pretty complicated history.
Okay.
It was once considered this, model institution. But over the years, it faced, budget cuts, staffing shortages, and a growing patient population.
Oh, wow.
So by the time Morgan and Anessa got there, it was a very different place.
Not a good place, I'm guessing.
Sure. It's not ideal. Our source describes it as overcrowded, understaffed,
Oh, no.
and heavily reliant on restraints and isolation to manage patients.
That sounds awful. How did Morgan deal with being in such a, restricted and depressing environment?
It was definitely a tough adjustment, especially since she was just a teenager when she arrived.
Yeah.
She basically spent all her formative years within those walls.
Yeah.
Our source describes her as initially being, really withdrawn and fearful,
Yeah.
struggling to adapt to the, strict routines and the lack of freedom.
It sounds more like a warehouse for the mentally ill than a place of, healing and rehabilitation.
A fair assessment.
Did that environment make her mental state worse?
Potentially.
Yeah.
According to our source, Morgan was denied antipsychotic medication for 19 months after arriving at Winnebago.
What? They didn't give her medication.
No, not for 19 months. And that's particularly concerning because medication is often a crucial part of treatment for schizophrenia,
Right.
helping to manage symptoms and stabilize moods.
So they basically withheld essential medical care from her.
It certainly seems that way.
Yeah.
And this lack of medication likely exacerbated her existing condition, making it even harder for her to, participate in therapy and make progress.
That's heartbreaking. It really does seem like the system was more focused on punishment
Yeah,
than rehabilitation.
it's a valid point.
But things did eventually change for Morgan, right?
They did.
Judge Boren ended up granting her conditional release.
He did. After spending 11 years at Winnebago,
11 years.
Judge Boren, the same judge who had initially sentenced her to 40 years, reversed his decision and allowed her to be released under strict supervision.
Wow, that's a huge change. What caused him to, change his mind like that?
Well, there are a few factors that likely contributed to this shift. For one, the public outcry surrounding the case had died down by then.
That makes sense.
And additionally, societal attitudes towards juvenile justice and mental health were starting to evolve.
Right. We've talked about that.
There was a growing recognition that, these harsh punishments, especially for young offenders, were often ineffective and even counterproductive.
Yeah.
There was a push for a more rehabilitative approach.
So it wasn't just Judge Boren changing his mind, but a reflection of a broader shift in how we view these things.
Exactly. Shift in societal values and a growing understanding of mental illness.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the role of advocacy.
Right.
There were a lot of people working behind the scenes to bring attention to Morgan's case and push for her release. They highlighted her progress in therapy, her remorse for her actions, and the fact that she no longer posed a threat to society.
They did some incredible work.
It's a good reminder that even in a system as rigid as the justice system, there's still room for compassion.
For sure.
And second chances.
Absolutely.
Speaking of changing times, what about the internet? It played such a big role in the initial fascination with this case.
Yeah.
How did that factor into Morgan's release?
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Back in 2014, the Slenderman stabbing was a global phenomenon.
It was huge.
It was everywhere, all over the news, dominating social media.
Yeah.
But by the time Morgan was released, the online world had kind of moved on.
It's like the internet has amnesia or something.
It's true.
Yeah.
It gobbles up these sensational stories, spits them out,
And it forgets about them.
and then forgets about them.
Did her release even make a blip on the radar?
It did, but not to the same extent. The digital landscape had become so much more fragmented by then.
Right.
Instead of one big narrative, there were all these little pockets of discussion happening across different platforms, often driven by algorithms and personalized feeds.
So the same forces that, amplified the case back in 2014 actually contributed to its obscurity later on.
It's kind of a paradox of our digital age. We have more information than ever,
Right.
but our collective attention span is shrinking.
For sure. But there's another side to this digital coin, right?
Yeah.
While the sensationalism surrounding the case had faded, social media, with all its flaws, also played a role in changing how we think about mental health.
Oh, absolutely.
Because back in 2014, talking about mental illness was still taboo.
Very much so.
But now it's much more normalized.
It is.
People are sharing our stories online, advocating for better resources,
It's amazing.
and challenging the stigma. How did this impact how people viewed Morgan's case?
I think it definitely contributed to a more nuanced understanding of her story. People were less quick to judge
Right.
and more willing to acknowledge the role mental illness played in her actions.
And people were more aware of the systemic failures too, right?
Yes, definitely. There was a growing recognition of things like the lack of mental health services for young people.
So even though the internet's attention had shifted,
Yeah,
it also helped to foster empathy for Morgan.
it did.
Okay. And did this shift in public perception impact the legal system at all?
I think so. Judges and juries aren't, immune to cultural shifts.
Right.
The increased awareness around mental health definitely impacted how Morgan's case was viewed
Yeah.
and ultimately contributed to her release.
It's amazing how societal values and legal interpretations can evolve together like that.
It is fascinating.
But beyond those changes and Judge Boren's change of heart, were there any legal reforms that helped Morgan get released?
Are you thinking about the movement towards juvenile justice reform?
Yeah, exactly. Were there any specific changes in Wisconsin law that impacted her case?
Well, there were a few key developments. In 2018, Wisconsin passed Act 185,
Okay.
which basically mandated the closure of those big, outdated juvenile prisons
Yeah,
and called for smaller regional facilities focused on treatment and rehabilitation.
that makes a lot more sense than just locking kids up.
It does. This legislation really reflected a growing understanding that locking kids up for long periods often does more harm than good.
So did this shift towards smaller treatment-focused facilities directly affect Morgan?
Well, it didn't directly impact her placement at Winnebago, as she was already there when the law was passed.
Right.
But it did reflect a change in thinking within the justice system,
Okay.
a move away from punishment
Yeah,
and towards rehabilitation.
I see.
This likely influenced Judge Bourne's decision to grant her conditional release. He saw that she had made progress in therapy,
Right.
that she was remorseful,
Mm-hmm.
and that she wasn't the same scared, delusional girl who had committed that terrible act 11 years prior.
Wow, so it really was a combination of things.
It was shifting values, increased awareness around mental health, legal reforms,
Yeah.
and even Judge Bourne's own personal evolution.
It shows that change is possible, even in a system as rigid as the justice system.
It does. But it's rarely a simple or predictable process.
No, it's messy.
It's messy. It involves individual stories, social movements, legal battles,
Yeah.
and sometimes even a bit of luck.
So Morgan was released. But after 11 years in a mental health facility, what kind of future awaits her? How does someone, reintegrate into society
Right.
after such a traumatic experience and being confined for so long?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah,
Reintegration is a long and challenging process.
for sure.
Especially for someone like Morgan who's experienced so much trauma
Right.
and who spent, her formative years in such a restricted environment. She'll need ongoing therapy, support from mental health professionals,
Yeah.
and a strong network of people who believe in her.
What about the public?
Yeah.
Will she be able to escape what happened? Will people let her move on and rebuild her life?
That's where things get tricky. While there's been a big shift in how we view mental health,
Yeah.
there's still a lot of stigma and fear
Mm.
around people who have committed violent crimes.
I mean, that's understandable, right?
It is,
Keep
but it's
track.
also crucial to remember that she was a child when this happened. A child who was deeply troubled
Yeah.
and who has since gone through years of therapy and rehabilitation.
That's why this deep dive is so important.
Absolutely.
It's not about, rehashing the details of the crime or debating the legal system.
Right.
It's about understanding mental illness, the challenges of reintegration,
Yeah,
and the possibility of redemption. It's about looking beyond the headlines.
it is.
And seeing Morgan as a human being.
With empathy and nuance.
Yeah, because justice isn't always about punishment.
No?
Sometimes it's about recognizing someone's humanity.
Yes.
And giving them a chance to heal and contribute to society.
And it's about creating a society that's more compassionate, more understanding,
Right.
and better equipped to support those struggling with mental health.
So Morgan's story isn't just a case study.
No, it's not.
It's a call to action.
It is.
It challenges us to examine our biases,
Yes.
to advocate for a more just and humane approach to mental health and criminal justice,
Absolutely.
and to believe in second chances.
I love that.
It really makes you wonder, if Morgan's case had happened today,
Yeah.
would things have been different? Would she have even been incarcerated?
That's a question we all need to think about.
It is, and that leads us to the final part of this deep dive,
Okay.
where we'll explore those what ifs,
Yeah.
and talk about what Morgan's case means for the future of juvenile justice and mental health.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Would things have been different for Morgan if this happened now?
It's tough to say, but it's a really interesting question. We have seen a pretty big shift in how we view mental health and juvenile justice
Right.
over the past decade.
Yeah.
Like, there's a much bigger focus on rehabilitation now, recognizing that young people's brains are still developing and that they can change more than adults.
So you're saying there's a real possibility she might not have gone to prison at all?
Yeah, I think it's possible.
I mean, today we understand so much more about how mental illness can really impact someone's judgment, especially for young people.
Yeah.
So the argument that Morgan and Anissa couldn't really understand what they were doing
Right, because of the delusions.
because of their delusions, yeah, that might have had a lot more weight in court today.
It's crazy to think about how, like, justice isn't this fixed thing.
It's not.
It's always changing.
It's fluid.
Based on, like, science and cultural values and how we define rehabilitation.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
And it's not just the legal system.
Right.
We're seeing these changes everywhere, like in our communities and schools, even online. There's a lot more awareness about mental health now.
Right.
People are more willing to talk about it and advocate for better support.
Yeah.
And we're realizing how much early intervention can help.
It's good to see that change happening.
It is.
But we can't pretend everything's perfect. Like, there are still huge gaps in mental health services, especially for young people.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't let up. We still need to push for better access to care, for policies that focus on rehabilitation, and to really challenge those stereotypes about mental illness.
We've come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to do.
For sure.
And I think it's really important to remember that every case is different.
It is.
Each person's story is so complex, there's no easy fix for these situations.
Yeah, there isn't. Morgan's story is a good example of why we need to approach these issues with empathy and be willing to listen to everyone's perspective.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to bring up Peyton Leutner.
Oh, yeah.
It's so easy to focus on the legal stuff and the bigger societal issues that we forget about, like the real human cost of this whole thing.
Absolutely. Peyton's life was completely changed by this. She went through physical and emotional trauma that's probably never going away.
Yeah.
And her family, too. They've been through so much.
It's a really important reminder that even as we talk about Morgan getting better and reintegrating into society, we can't ignore the pain she caused.
Right. Talking about justice for Morgan doesn't erase what happened to Peyton.
Yeah.
It's important to acknowledge both sides,
Absolutely. This whole deep dive has been really, eye-opening.
It has.
It's made me rethink this case, think about mental illness in a new way, and how justice can actually evolve.
Yeah.
But I'm also left with this feeling of, unease, because there just aren't simple answers to these questions.
I think that's a good thing.
It is.
Yeah, I think it's healthy. Because this case forces us to face some hard truths. Truths about ourselves, about society, and how much we don't know about why people do the things they do.
It reminds us that we need to be humble,
Yeah.
and keep learning and talking about these things.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing your insights and helping us understand this case.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us. We hope this episode has challenged you to think differently about this case, about mental health, and about justice. And until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.